How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. Today I'm going to be using these XPS foam scraps to deal with my fear of deep water. You may be wondering what foam and deep water have to do with each other, and the answer is almost nothing, because foam floats. But foam can be easily made to look like convincing rocks, which sink, so they're often found in deep water. The first step was to slice up and glue together different pieces and layers of foam, and I didn't have too much of an idea of where I was going, but I knew that eventually I'd find some promising shapes. I sliced one of my pieces in half, which gave me a combo of a wedge on a rectangle, and I began refining that shape to appear more rocky on one side and flat and even on the other. I did the same thing with the other half. These two will eventually become the opposite corners of the diorama. I also made sure to create a spot on the top where I could mimic some light coming through from the surface. And here you can see the basic shape of the rock formation that I decided to go with. The next step was to put away the hot wire table and clean up the rest of the mess. Then I could start giving the foam a more rock-like appearance. I started with my utility knife, and then I switched to a Dremel to refine the shape and create more inconsistent and organic texture. I know I always say this, but when creating foam dust, it's always important to wear a respirator and a good idea to vacuum up the dust as you go. The dremeling process creates a bunch of loose foam fuzzies on the surface of the rock, so to get rid of that and push the water-eroded look even further, I hit it with a heat gun. You can kind of see it getting a little bit cleaner and glossier right here. After that, and while still wearing my face filter, I sanded the rest of the sides nice and flat. The next step was to seal the foam with a protective layer of Mod Podge and black paint. The black paint helps me know where I have applied it better. I'm going to be priming this thing with an acrylic primer, so this step might not have been necessary for this build, but it's generally a good idea to protect the surface of the foam with something like Mod Podge. I left that to dry, and it was time to kitbash a scuba diver. While none of these 1:48 scale World War II US infantry GIs looks like a scuba diver at the moment, a little bit of customization will go a long way. I found a soldier with a pose that would work. I nipped him and the rest of his body parts free. A little bit of flashing needed to be scraped off and cleaned up before making my significant changes, starting with adjusting the angle of the foot and removing the head entirely. I drilled out a spot in the neck where a new head will go later, and then I scraped away a few details and added new ones with an engraving tool. The goal was to make this guy look like a mix between a modern scuba diver and a not as modern scuba diver. So I didn't remove all the folds of the fabric so that he looked like he was wearing a wetsuit. Rather, I'll be painting it to look more like a dry suit. I made the oxygen tanks out of some sprue pieces, which I shaped and sanded down to have some nice rounded ends, like you'd see on an oxygen tank. And then I used some wire and little bits that I snipped off of a bazooka to create the valve and gauge. For the flippers, I glued some 020 styrene to the feet of the diver and then refined the shape till I had something that I liked. Having them glued to the feet first and then working on them actually made them a lot easier to work on. I threw a new head on the diver, and then I glued a thin slice of a styrene tube right in the middle of the blank face. To make some straps, I flattened a tiny styrene rod with some pliers. I used the same method to create all of the straps that I added to this guy. I connected the mask to the oxygen tanks, and then I finished the guy's harness, and with that, the diver was done, and I am pretty content with this conversion. At this point, the Mod Podge had dried, and once the diver was mounted onto a wargaming base and stuck into a painting handle, I loaded up my airbrush with some black acrylic primer and began priming. And while I paint, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. Following the black primer, I gave everything a highlight from the direction of the light source, which in this case is the sunshine. I did the same thing for the diver, trying to match the same light source that the rocks got. For the color on the rocks, I did something a little different than normal, and I simply glazed them with green, blue, and red, which is a little simple, but also felt just right for some ominous underwater rocks. The diver got a little bit more attention. I was tempted to paint him up like a diver from Subnautica, but the style of the suit doesn't quite match the aesthetic of Subnautica, so I went with a more traditional old-school yellow. Speaking of Subnautica, this build was partially inspired by the Subnautica 2 trailer, which I watched a couple weeks ago. I don't have too much time for video games these days, but multiplayer Subnautica sounds like a lot of fun. Nothing like experiencing thalassophobia and submechanophobia with your friends. I took my freshly painted diver and rocks outside and I gave them a protective clear coat to prevent any bleeding into the resin. And speaking of which, it's time to build a dam which will hold back the resin. Like I said at the beginning, foam floats in water. You know what else it floats in? Resin. I experienced that one time. It was a surprise to me. It shouldn't have been, but it almost ruined a resin pour. So in order to keep this foam from floating, I glued it down to the bottom piece of acrylic using some silicone adhesive. I then assembled the walls around the rocks using a small bit of super glue just to hold them in place, and then all the additional strength and water tightness came from a consistent bead of silicone, which I left to dry for 24 hours. Historically, I've had a lot of leftover resin after my pours, but I did something that was suggested in the comments by many of you, which was to fill it up with rice to find the exact volume. So I did that this time. Thank you very much, everyone who suggested that. And thankfully, I had just enough resin left in this old bottle to get the job done. After measuring out the resin and the hardener, I tinted everything to a subtle aquamarine color, and then mixed it thoroughly with a drill and a mixing paddle. The next step was to load everything into a vacuum pot and degas it. Although the resin looks nice and clear at this point, it actually has a bunch of little bubbles in it, which will become apparent during the curing process. In order to reduce that, we can stick it in a vacuum pot, which causes all of those bubbles to get bigger and rise to the surface, forming a poisonous crema, which you do not want to drink. Once that has dissipated, your resin is nice and clear and should not form any bubbles during the curing process. I planned to suspend the diver in the resin using 2 separate pours, but because of the tight space, I realized it wouldn't have been all that noticeable, and it would have delayed the video's release, so I decided to just go ahead and glue him in place and then pour the resin. A few bubbles from air pockets under the foam escaped to the top, which I was able to pop easily with a butane torch, and I left that to cure for 3 days. With the resin fully cured, it was time to demold, which went nice and smoothly and also made some very satisfying sounds as well. With the last bit of acrylic removed, it was time for the finishing touches. I cleaned up the edges, and at the beginning of this project, I was planning on adding a light source directly to the diorama, but I decided I wanted to keep it as is, and you'll see why for the final shots. With no light, battery, or wiring, the last thing to do is to clean up a few spots on the sides with black 4.0, and after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.